introduce yourself and explain your career to this point? How you became to specialise in issues like energy, EV and extreme heat?
Yeah, so my name's Dr. Tom Longden. I'm here at the Urban Transformations Research Centre at Western Sydney University. My background's actually economics and statistics, econometrics, things like that. So I was really interested in how people make choices with a bit of a lean towards those sort of new technologies. Worked at different universities across the board, but one of the themes has always been about equity and making sure that the rollout of these new technologies are equitable. That there's conversations to have about solar panels there, but also EVs. And so one of the projects we've been working on here is about getting more EV charging into apartments, for example.
Yeah, EVs have become more and more popular in recent times. Can you explain what an EV actually is and how it differs from a regular car?
Yeah, look, it's actually more complicated than you think because there's lots of terms. So there's the battery electric vehicle where you've basically got a battery in that vehicle, but that includes the hybrids. So, you can have a Toyota Corolla with a hybrid, a little battery there, and that's actually charged off the braking mechanism. You can have a plug-in hybrid, which is actually a petrol vehicle with a battery that you need to charge through a plug, where basically it acts like a improvement in the efficiency, right? So it's a boost to your efficiency. And then you've got the full-on electric vehicles, which are very much just a battery. And it's interesting that those vehicles tend to be the platform or the base is all battery, and then there's no sort of fossil fuel based fuel in that. It is all based on electricity. Those vehicles are quite interesting. They're actually quite powerful. But yeah, you have typically three types of vehicles. You've got hybrid, plug-in hybrid, and then a large battery electric vehicle that basically just runs off an electric motor.
What is the environmental impact of a petrol car in relation to one of those EVs you just explained?
Yeah, well look, the big thing is about the fuel and where that comes from. So for any fossil fuel vehicle, so diesel, petrol, we're basically importing most of that oil-based fuel into the country, and then when you use your car, you probably most people don't realise, but you're actually burning that fuel, and so you've got air pollution, but also CO2 emissions that happen from that. So the big thing to think about there is that the traditional fossil fuel vehicle, you are actually burning a fuel to get around. And so people are concerned about the CO2 emissions and that impact on greenhouse gases and climate change, but also air pollution. And it's one thing that a lot of people forget is that what comes out of the exhaust is dirty, and so you've got the air pollution problem there. Where for an electric vehicle, it's the source of electricity that matters. But what's interesting is when people drive around, there's no exhaust. So you're not getting that sort of pedestrian impact of air pollution impacting the people that are in the street or in that interaction. But then you get a really important conversation about where the electricity is coming from, the time of charging. But the benefit there is that as you decarbonise your electricity grid, basically you've got the win-win with an electric vehicle. There is contention about electric vehicles about where some of the minerals come from. We have that issue with all batteries, so even mobile phones, those critical minerals, some of the mining there is not as environmentally friendly, but you've really got that comparison to that sort of big oil versus where electricity comes from, and then all those component parts.
In your opinion, why are EVs becoming more popular? Is it a consciousness of the environmental impacts? Is it affordability, or is it just the next new thing?
Partly it's the vehicle options. So we were sort of lagging with how many types of EVs were in the country. For a long time, there were some statistics that compared to the UK, we had, less than 1/3 of the vehicle options. And so we're starting to catch up. So now it's not just a choice about, an EV per se, but what type of car. And I think there's the cheaper EV options. So we're sort of catching up to some of the other countries that have had a little bit more of an option with EVs. Some of the people who are first movers, they're definitely doing it because they're environmentally conscious, air pollution, CO2 emissions. But other people are also quite mindful that they don't want to go to a petrol station, right? And so that's one of the benefits. And that's one of the interesting things is that people are weighing off the type of vehicle they would like you know, the style and everything like that, even the brands and other issues like that. But also that thing of, well, if I pay a bit more upfront, I'll save on the cost of running the vehicle over time. And so there's some, you know, media and other analyses finding that for some people actually in outer suburbs, the running costs, they're basically people are doing the sums and saying, well, look, if I pay for a bit more upfront, I'll save over time because I'm paying less in petrol prices. And that's a big mechanism, and there might be the win-win with the less emissions occurring, so it's more guilt-free driving type of things. But one thing we're finding is that some of the early adopters of EVs are actually in outer suburbs where installing a charger in your own garage is much easier. And so that was something that surprised a lot of experts, is that some of the outer suburbs actually have a lot of EV adoption or early adoption, simply because they've got the longer fuel costs, so they're really doing the sums. And if you drive a bit more than, you know, an extra $10 a month, or not even a month, a week or a day, adds up. So some of those people are saying, well, actually, I might pay for a bit more up front, but I know that I don't need to go to a petrol station again. I don't have to worry about what the petrol price is doing. But one thing that we have is still for utes and vans and other things, we're a bit behind. We don't have those options that other countries have. So it's, you know, people making a decision about their second car or how they get to work. But for tradies and other people, you know, there'll be a lot of people thinking about making that move, but maybe those vehicle options aren't there. One thing that's really interesting is for some tradies who don't have to drive that much but still need a bit of power, but also there's some vehicle options overseas where you can actually use the battery as a backup resource to charge tools and things like that. So for some people, it's actually a win-win in that way as well, because you actually end up having a drivable battery, but for others, maybe, you know, range anxiety is one of the things holding people back. People get worried not just about how far they'll drive, but what if I go here and there's no charger? What if I go here? And that's one of the, you know, things that are really a barrier to EV adoption at the moment. It would definitely be that thing that if you live in your own, and if you live and own your own home, it's much easier for you to decide what charger you install and what you basically do. So one of the things we're finding is sort of in areas like the inner west, if you live in an apartment and have on-street parking, then there's a lot of anxiety about how you'll charge the vehicle. And some people are still doing that. You do see people who live in apartments doing that, but then they might have to do the once a week really big, you know, rapid fast charge, where for other people who have the flexibility, they can install like just a really small trickle, like some people call it a trickle charger, where it's basically just a bit bigger than a mains power point. And so each night you can just top up your vehicle, and that's enough for, you know, 50, 60, even maybe 100 kilometres of range, which is really adequate for most people. And it's interesting that some manufacturers, what they've done is people are not concerned about their day-to-day commute, they're worried about the weekend or the holidays. So that's one of the things is that we're seeing is that some people are making that decision that it's, you know, some people are hesitating because it's hard to charge in their area, and some people are finding it easier to charge. And that's definitely part of the conversation about why people are switching to EVs.
Can you help us bust some common EV myths and see if we can get to the bottom of them? So do EV batteries last long, or will the owner spend hours recharging it?
No, look, so it really depends on that balance between driving and how much, but look, most EVs will have in the full charge at least 300 to 500 kilometres of range. And people are finding that even older EVs are keeping that sort of range, right? So there is a little bit of like a sort of, you know, degradation in the battery over time, but most EVs are still getting up to that similar range. And that's one of the interesting things is that most people do not drive 300 kilometres a day or even a week. So, you know, there will be people who choose to buy an EV even if they're not sure where they charge it, because they've worked out that they can actually do a full charge once a week and then have a good amount of range.
Another concern is batteries. Do they deteriorate over time? And is the cost of replacing a new battery in an EV similar to that of a petrol car? So
and we're sort of finding that out now. So we're sort of entering those years now where we have a sort of an idea of what the second-hand EV market looks like, and we're finding that the batteries will have, differ by age, but they're still keeping up in terms of how much power they have and the recharge. And so batteries is an interesting conversation because there's different qualities of batteries. The ones that are going into the EVs tend to be very high quality batteries, which don't degrade as much as some of the cheaper appliances that we have, where you really see that over time you're getting less power for each full charge. So it seems that EVs are holding up really well in terms of that livelihood. I think what's interesting is what happens with second-hand markets. And I think there's a role for governments to play to offer battery testing to people, so that when they buy a second-hand EV, they basically get a certificate or some information about the quality of the battery and how well it's held up over the years. So it only takes a couple of years for an EV to be considered greener than a petrol vehicle, because you've got that. You might have a more intensive sort of manufacturing process with a bit more of a carbon footprint up front, but then you don't have all those emissions happening during year in, year out, right? So you get this gain. It depends where you are in terms of the grid, and it depends how you calculate that as well. So if you really take into account in different areas, charging overnight will be based heavily on coal or gas in some states, so that increases your carbon footprint. But then over the lifetime of the vehicle, people are expecting those sort of emissions from the electricity grid to come down. The win-win-win is a house with a solar panel, batteries, and then the EV, and then you are really sure that you're getting the lowest emissions to charge. However, even relying on the grid, it only takes a few years of driving for you to break even and then see those gains in terms of reduced emissions, because you've got to remember you've got all the emissions that are embodied in the vehicle. So you've got a carbon footprint to begin with because of the emissions that occur to create the vehicle, but then you've got what happens as you drive. And with the petrol vehicles, the diesel vehicles, every time you drive you're making emissions, which are higher than the emissions from even a relatively dirty grid. Of course, in some areas, if you've got a very dirty electricity grid, then those, that sort of benefit doesn't come through until you really drive many more kilometres. But yeah, it only takes a couple of years for those upfront emissions to be offset by the lower emissions in the electricity grid.
Can EVs tow a caravan, a trailer, a boat, anything someone might need?
Yeah, EV's actually really powerful, and there's a video online of one of the Tesla Cybertrucks actually towing a ute backwards while the ute is trying to go forwards. So that's one of the myths, definitely, is the power you get out of the EV. However, as you use more power, of course, the battery discharges more. So the range we're talking about in terms of 300 kilometres is different, or 500 kilometres per battery charge will be lower given that you tow. So there's a bit of a benefit cost sort of thing there. But definitely power isn't an issue with an EV. You actually get much more return because there's a bigger efficiency from pumping electricity into an electric motor than with a petrol or diesel vehicle, because you basically have a lot of energy loss. And so you will have that trade-off and discussion about power, but even some of the smaller EVs, in terms of electricity in and power out, they're actually much stronger. However, that's one of the things you would have to sort of calculate, is what range you expect and how much you're weighing. And look, that's true as well of petrol and diesel vehicles, but the availability of petrol stations is greater. So, and that's one of the sort of myths as well, right? So you might be able to tow more, but you're actually needing to fill up a lot more.
In your opinion, do you predict the growth of EV cars will continue as it is and more people will purchase them?
I'm relatively optimistic, because it's as different manufacturers bring out more models. We also have generational change. Some of my friends, their kids are just for them, the only option in the future would be an EV. So we're definitely seeing that change in shift and mood. We're seeing charging is becoming more available, so the building codes now has a requirement that new builds apartments need charging infrastructure in there, so that's becoming easier. So I'm quite optimistic. It really depends on the vehicle options that come out, the ease of charging and personal preferences. We're definitely seeing some people are adamant that an EV is not for them and it will never be for them, and then you're seeing people who are starting to think, well, maybe not this time, but maybe next time.